Thanks for coming tonight. I'm Ellis and this is Maya, and we are representatives of Students for Justice in Palestine here at NYU, and we are one of the many groups co-sponsoring this event tonight. We are really thrilled and honored to be able to host this awesome panel of speakers, along with our co-sponsors in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, the Gender and Sexuality Studies, Asian Pacific American Studies, American Studies, Jewish Voice for Peace, New York, the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies, and NYU Law Students for Justice in Palestine. And Maya is now going to introduce the panel officially.
Hi, everyone. Just before we start, I just wanted to say that I think it's a really a good timing to have this kind of conversation in light of everything that's happening on the streets of Ferguson and Oakland and here in New York, as well as on the streets of Jerusalem and in Gaza City. And I think it's important because it's very inspiring to see how these connections are being made between what's happening on both sides of the Atlantic in that regard. Particularly, I want to share an anecdote. In 2011, a group of U.S. officials went to Israel to get training in not only counterterrorism, but also how best to deal with popular protest. Among them was former St. Louis Police Chief Timothy Fitch. So we can see that the lessons were indeed learned and internalized. And it's really great to see how discussions of U.S. militarization of police forces is now being discussed and widely protested in this country as well. So to introduce our speakers today, Omar Barghouti. He is an independent Palestinian researcher and human rights activist, co-founder of the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, otherwise known as PACB, and the Palestinian civil society-led Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement, BDS. He is the research fellow at the International Institute of Social Justice in The Hague. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree in electrical engineering from Columbia University and a master's in philosophy and ethics from Tel Aviv University. He is the author of BDS, The Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Omar.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the organizers for inviting me. I'm proud to be at NYU again. Before I start, I want to pay tribute to Native Americans on whose ancestral land we stand today, and to a very dear friend who passed away earlier today, Radwa Ashur, a famous Egyptian writer, intellectual, and feminist. I.F. Stone, the late Jewish American intellectual, wrote as far back as 1967, Israel is creating a kind of moral schizophrenia in world Jewry. In the outside world, the welfare of Jewry depends on the maintenance of secular, non-racial, pluralistic societies. In Israel, Jewry finds itself defending a society in which mixed marriages cannot be legalized, in which non-Jews have a lesser status than Jews, and in which the ideal is racist and exclusivist, end of quote. And that was in 1967, not now, before the nation-state law that they're talking about. With the discussion of the Jewish nation-state law that's going on in Israel today, things have gotten much, much worse for Israel, that is, not just for the Palestinians. In fact, many people think that Venezuela and Bolivia are the most important countries pushing for sanctions against Israel. I think they're the second strongest. The strongest country pushing for sanctions against Israel is Israel. So we're letting the secret out today, our secret admirers, the government of Israel. The former Mossad chief, Shabtai Shavit, who served in the Mossad for many, many years, said in Haaretz a week ago that for the first time ever, he feels that the Zionist project as a whole could collapse. This is not coming from some lefty in Israel, but from a Mossad chief. And he explains that the state of Israel is dependent upon the United States. Despite that, the relationship between the country has reached an unprecedented low point. And he added that Europe, Israel's biggest market, has grown tired of Israel and is heading toward imposing sanctions on Israel. In fact, for the first time in many, many, many years, in possibly 2 decades, we're hearing the word sanctions being mentioned in the hallways of decision makers in Europe. And Shabtai Shavit went on to say, university campuses in the West, like yours, particularly in the US, are hothouses for the future leadership of their countries. We're losing the fight for support for Israel in the academic world, he says. An increasing number of Jewish students are turning away from Israel. The global BDS movement against Israel has grown, and quite a few Jews are members, end of quote. Now, this is really interesting for a former chief of Mossad to mention the Jewish dimension in the BDS movement, because for quite some time, they've never mentioned that. Israel has always ignored completely the Jewish dimension in the BDS movement, which I'll focus a bit on today, and I started with the I.F. Stone quote specifically for that purpose. Israel's main attack on the BDS movement has always been that it's an anti-Semitic movement. It seeks to destroy Israel, the only Jewish state. And because Israel is the only Jewish state, by definition, Zionists argue, a boycott of Israel is anti-Semitic, by definition. And in fact, by definition, saying that is anti-Semitic. Saying that a boycott of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic is an anti-Semitic statement, because it's equating Israel and the Jews. An attack on Israel is an attack on the Jews, inherently. And therefore, Israel and the Jews are one and the same. That statement is an anti-Semitic statement, because it says all Jews are a monolithic sum, completely represented by Israel. And that, of course, denies Jews of any human diversity, as if they're non-human. Superhuman, subhuman, it's the same, just non-human. But why is Israel so concerned about the growth of the BDS movement? Because you would think a country so strong as Israel, economically, a nuclear power, supported by the only superpower in the world, by your tax money, and so on, why should it even worry about a nonviolent movement based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Who cares, right? Well, Israel does care, because Israel, despite its power, is not designed to face such nonviolent challenges, in fact. It is scared precisely because BDS is anchored in international law, precisely because BDS is a human rights movement that is opposed to all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism. That scares Israel. Israel does not know how to deal with such challenges. When the Presbyterian Church earlier this year in June passed a divestment resolution against HP, Caterpillar, and Motorola Solutions, what could Israel have done? Bomb the Presbyterian Church with its F-16s? I mean, really, it tests the limit of Israel's power. With the recent Israeli massacre in Gaza in this summer, July and August, the BDS movement reached yet another tipping point, we feel. We're seeing a lot of openness, not just among leftists, liberals, American Studies Association, progressives. We're really seeing an openness around the world. As many of you have noticed, we're seeing hundreds and hundreds of academics, anthropologists, historians, several academic associations around the world, major cultural figures coming out in support of BDS. We're seeing huge associations like the National Union of Students in Britain, which represents 7 million members, something to envy in this country, that they have one union representing 7 million students, came out in support of BDS. The executive of that union came out in support of BDS. But we're also noticing a difference among pension funds, banks, huge investment firms, and so on. They're starting to take action against Israel. Earlier this year, PGGM, the second largest Dutch pension fund, a $200 billion fund, decided to divest from all Israeli banks involved in the occupation. The Norwegian pension fund, the absolute largest in the world, divested from 2 Israeli companies involved in the construction of settlements. Even the German government decided to condition future high-tech agreements with Israel on an exclusion of settlement entities. Any Israeli entity working in settlements would be excluded from any high-tech agreements with Germany, mind you. And so on and so forth. Danske Bank, the largest bank in Denmark, decided to sever its links with Hapoalim, the second largest bank in Israel. So we're starting to see an economic impact, not just academic and cultural. Many people were questioning the logic of the BDS movement because it started with academic and cultural boycott. actually, 2004, PACB was launched, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, a year before the historic BDS code that was issued by the absolute majority of civil society. And many people question the logic of that. Why would Palestinians shoot themselves in the foot? Boycotting academia, isn't that the most progressive in Israel that's supporting Palestinian rights at the forefront of the fight against occupation, and so on and so forth? Of course, that's a myth. Academia in Israel is as conservative, as right-wing as the rest of Israeli society. There's absolutely no distinction. In fact, they might be more guilty because they know better, but they're still enabling the system of injustice. And in fact, academia in Israel has played a key role in planning, implementing, justifying, and whitewashing Israel's system, regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. So they're extremely guilty. But the point was, our strategy depended on attacking the brand, Israel. Israel has, for decades, built a brand, the only democracy in a sea of barbarians, right? We've heard that, a villa in a jungle of Arabs, and so on and so forth. That brand was quite effective. Israeli academics, Israeli artists played a very important role in projecting that brand of a liberal, progressive, scientifically advanced, democratic society in a sea of backwardness and so on. So the academic and cultural boycott attacked that, the brand Israel. And Israel, in fact, wanted to seem as if it's ignoring the BDS movement, but immediately upon launching the BDS call in 2005, they launched the Brand Israel campaign. That was their main response. The Brand Israel campaign is a campaign by the Foreign Ministry of Israel, and it's a typical propaganda campaign, sending Israeli artists, dancers, musicians, nanotechnology experts, and so on, to show Israel's prettier face, as they put it, to the world. They don't want Israel to be associated with war, racism, violence, and so on, but to be associated with nice things like Beethoven and Pina Bausch, modern dance, and so on. So that's what branding is all about, and that's why we attacked that. So that wasn't kind of a diversion. It was a key part of our strategy, attacking the brand. And in fact, we were vindicated. It took a long time, but eventually, attacking the brand from the academic and cultural sphere did spill over to the economic sphere. So in 2014, we started to see a real impact on economy. It's too early to tell how big an impact it is, but already we're getting Israeli ministers like Tzipi Livni, Yair Lapid, the few still rational ministers in a very irrational government, are saying that BDS is growing, as Tzipi Livni put it, exponentially, and we'd better do something to stop it. But what is BDS about, and how did we get here? BDS, the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which, as I said, was launched by the absolute majority in Palestinian society, was launched in 2005, calling for 3 specific rights without which Palestinians cannot exercise self-determination, which is an inalienable right under international law. Ending the occupation of 67, including the colonies, the wall, and so on. Ending Israel's system of racial discrimination, which meets the UN definition of apartheid, and I'll speak a bit about that in a minute. And the right of return for refugees, the absolute most important right for Palestinians. Why is it the most important right? It's not just an ethical issue, it's a pragmatic issue based on numbers. 68% of the Palestinian people are refugees or IDPs, internally displaced persons. 68%. That's about 50% in exile of the Palestinian people, and a huge minority of Palestinians in the occupied territories, as well as Palestinians in the State of Israel. A huge minority are internally displaced persons, which makes the Palestinian refugee community the largest by far among the Palestinian people. Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Gaza are 38% only of the Palestinian people. And Palestinian citizens of Israel are 12%. So when people say, we support Palestinian rights, and therefore we want an end to the occupation, they're not supporting Palestinian rights. They're supporting most of the rights of 38% of the Palestinian people. And in fact, today, reducing Palestinian rights to ending the occupation only serves Israeli interests more than anything else. It aims at making Israel a stronger apartheid. Get rid of 4.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and make the Jewish majority in the state of Israel even bigger. So we get rid of the Palestinians. And that ignores our basic rights. Connected to this argument is the issue of, do we call for a boycott of Israel or a boycott of the occupation? We hear that in this country. I don't think in any other country, even in Canada, we don't hear that. But in the US, that's the only place where we hear this nonsense. But why is it nonsense? Because the last time we've checked, the UN roster did not include a country called the occupation. It does not exist. I mean, we don't know what that is. The only country that's doing anything to us is called Israel. We don't have any other country called the occupation to boycott. It doesn't exist. And in international law, the legal entity responsible for the crimes of the occupier, building settlements, ethnic cleansing, the massacres in Gaza, and so on, is the state of Israel. It's the occupying power. So even those who are morally inconsistent and couldn't care less about the rights of 62% of the Palestinian people and only care about 38%, those in the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, even they should boycott Israel. Because Israel is doing the occupation. Even if you ignore the right of return and apartheid within Israel and so on, you should boycott, you should target Israel, because it is the state responsible for the occupation. In every other situation, it's the state that's responsible. In Darfur, people called for divestment from Sudan. In Tibet, a boycott against China, and so on and so forth. Only when it comes to Israel do we hear this nonsense, this artificial distinction between the state of Israel and the occupation. We don't want to boycott Israel because that's somehow anti-Semitic. But we want to boycott the occupation. So I mentioned apartheid, and I said I'll come back to that. Why is Israel's regime in the state of Israel, why does it amount to apartheid? Are we using inflammatory language? Are we trying to say that Israel is equivalent to South Africa? No, we're just saying that there's a UN definition of apartheid that even some grand intellectuals in this country don't seem to understand. Some say, oh, Israel is not an apartheid because the majority is Jewish. Well, guess what? The UN definition about apartheid has nothing to do with majorities and minorities. Here's the UN definition. The International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, which was passed in 1973 and went into effect in 1976, defines apartheid as establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them, in particular by means such as segregation, expropriation of land, and denial of the right to leave and return to their country, the right to a nationality, and the right to freedom of movement and residence. Duh. I mean, precisely. It's like they're defining Israel, right? Furthermore, in 2002, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court defined the crime of apartheid as inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. But some people might say, well, that definition says racial discrimination. But in Israel, it's not a race. See, Zionists are very flexible. Jews are a race when they need them to be, but they're not a race when they don't need them to be. So, what's the definition of race and racial discrimination in the United Nations? Because, Zionists tend to think they are the center of the universe. They define everything. Well, luckily we have the UN. So, racial discrimination in international law is defined. Actually, this is the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Google it, 1966. Article 1 says racial discrimination is any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. precisely. That's the definition of racial discrimination, and that's exactly what Israel has. Israel actually has more than 50 laws that directly discriminate against its non-Jewish citizens, the indigenous Palestinians, Christians, and Muslims. Just because they're not Jewish, they're not entitled to the full set of rights that Jewish Israelis are entitled to. With this new Jewish nation-state law, and I really understand the frustration of Netanyahu and his government. Why is the whole world shouting about this new law? What's really new in it? I mean, they're making something that has always been there, just a bit more official. Israel has always been an apartheid state. In its basic laws, Israel has no constitution. In its basic laws, which have constitutional power, Israel privileged not only its Jewish citizens, the Jews of the world. So it has this extraterritorial kind of definition of nationality. Israel belongs to the Jewish nation. It does not belong to its citizens. And it's the only country on earth that has such a definition. And Israel does not belong to its citizens. It does not give any equal rights to its citizens who do not happen to be Jewish. So Israel is the only country that does not recognize its own nationality. There is no Israeli nationality. So when people use in the US media Israeli nationals, that does not exist. The Supreme Court in Israel, government and the Knesset rejected that notion, even the Supreme Court. So there is no Israeli nationality to make discrimination much easier. So this new proposed law just makes this more official, but it has always existed, in fact. So because the Palestinian people are divided into those three main communities, occupied territories of 67, Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, and Palestinians in exile, the BDS call focused on the three basic rights: ending occupation, ending apartheid, and the right of return. And to achieve those three basic rights, we called for economic, military, academic, cultural, financial boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. But some people might say, are sanctions even possible in this case? Yes, they are, but they come after a lot of B and D. That's why S comes last. You need to do a lot of boycotting, a lot of divestment, build a grassroots movement to get to the level of sanctions. And today, it is no longer a dream. As I said, for the first time in decades, even the European Union is secretly discussing imposing sanctions if Israel crosses certain red lines. And they've actually set some red lines for Israel that it should not cross. Before I end, Professor Joseph Levine from the University of Massachusetts wrote in the New York Times, and I have no idea how they published this in the New York Times. He questioned the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state, but among other things, he said, the very idea of a Jewish state is undemocratic, a violation of the self-determination rights of its non-Jewish citizens, and therefore morally problematic. He says, he ends his article saying, there's an unavoidable conflict between being a Jewish state and a democratic state. It's an oxymoron, basically. I want to emphasize, he says, that there's nothing anti-Semitic in pointing this out. And it's time the question was discussed openly on its merits without the charge of anti-Semitism hovering in the background. So this is a very important contribution to this debate. To end, yes, I won't go into details about BDS successes because it could take the whole evening. But to end, we focus on the three basic rights because the Palestinian people are divided, as I said, into three main communities. And as Archbishop Desmond Tutu said in the US Congress, actually in the 80s, when they were discussing polishing apartheid, making apartheid more tenable in South Africa, he told a US congressional subcommittee, I'm not interested in picking up crumbs of compassion thrown from the table of someone who considers himself my master. I want the full menu of rights. And that's exactly what Palestinians are seeking, the full menu of rights. To close, in his poem, Message to the Living, Henk van Radwijk, a Dutch poet of resistance, a famous Dutch poet of resistance against German occupation during World War II, wrote, a people giving in to tyrants will lose more than body and goods. The light will be extinguished. End of quote. On Sunday, September 14th this year, a few weeks after the end of Israeli hostilities, and despite all the death, destruction, and trauma, Hundreds of thousands of Gaza's children, almost literally, rose from under the rubble that much of Gaza was reduced to and went with enthusiasm to their damaged schools, carrying their dusty books and injured souls. Their eyes were shining with hope for a dignified life. BDS empowers Palestinians and worldwide supporters of a just peace to keep this hope alight. Thank you.